Using the writing of Debbie Thomas as foundation for today's message, Source of Love, Love Incarnate, Love's Power. Even at the best of times, it's hard to get excited about Trinity Sunday. Most Christian festivals honor events that are fun to describe and dramatize. The angel Gabriel's appearance to Mary, Jesus' transfiguration atop a mountain, his birth and resurrection, the arrival of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. But Trinity Sunday invites us to consider a conception of God. 1 in 3, 3 in 1, huh? Needless to say, we are not living in the best of times. Over the past weeks, several American cities have descended into chaos as citizens protest the horrific murder of George Floyd. What's being uncovered south of the border and here at home is centuries-old injustice, and the pain spilling into our streets is too deep for words. Meanwhile, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to devastate our planet. All over the world, catastrophic headlines cast shadows over our days. Many of us are tired, heartsick, anxious, and overwhelmed. Some of us are ill. Some of us are mourning loved ones who have died. Some of us are facing economic uncertainty or ruin. Some of us are devastated by the divisions and inequalities that infect our communities. Some of us are angry about what's happening politically. Some of us are barely hanging on to belief in one God. Now the church wants us to contemplate 3? Why? If you're like me, you've been on the receiving end, or maybe even the giving end, of many well-meaning but inadequate attempts to explain the triune God. Oh, well, the Trinity, it's sort of like water, liquid, vapor, and ice. 3 phases, 1 entity. The Trinity is like that. Or think of a tree, the roots, the trunk, and the branches. 3 parts, 1 tree. Or how about an egg? The shell, the egg white, and the yolk. Or a triangle. Or St. Patrick's shamrock, 3 petals, 1 clover. Or, courtesy of John Wesley, 3 candles in a room, 1 light by which to read. All of these analogies, beautiful though they are, fall short, and none of them address the deeper question, why should we care? What difference does the 3 in 1 make? Fine, God is Creator, Christ, and Holy Spirit. So what? Given the state our world is in right now, why should the Christian doctrine of the Trinity matter? Well, maybe for starters, the Trinity can teach us a lesson in humility. In this divided and polarized moment when religion is so often used as a weapon of war, it's easy to imagine that we have the monopoly on the divine. It's easy to grow smug and complacent and to assume that our articulation of faith, our liturgy, our denomination, and our worship practices capture the best version of who God is and what God desires. One thing the Trinity does by its very complexity is challenge this assumption. The truth of God will always exceed us. The truth of God will always be more than our tiny, easily overwhelmed minds can bear. The truth of God will always confront, convict, and remake us, even as it soothes and affirms us. This is a good thing. It is good and right and necessary to remember that we are created in God's image, even though we much prefer to remake God into our own image. So we begin our celebration of Trinity Sunday with the humble acknowledgement that we are out of our depth. We begin in fear and trembling, rejecting our own arrogance and recognizing that when it comes to comprehending God, we are wholly dependent on divine revelation. But then what? Why else does the Trinity matter? Perhaps it matters right now because what we believe about the nature of God, in whose image we are created, is a matter of life and death. How can we know who we are and what we were made for and who we should be to each other unless we know who God is. If the desire and delight of God is that we live into the fullness of the imago Dei, or image of God, then we must commit ourselves to studying and experiencing God's nature in all of its fullness and complexity. So, is there anything we can say with assurance or honor, with abandon on this Trinity Sunday? Franciscan priest and theologian Richard Rohr argued that caring about the Trinity requires orienting ourselves in a new way. Don't start with one and try and make it into three, he writes in his book, The Divine Dance. Start with three and see that this is the deepest nature of the one. Start with three and see that this is the deepest nature of the one. What might it look like to follow Rohr's advice? What will we discover about God's character, God's personality, and God's priorities if we see threeness as the ground and essence of God's being? Well, here are a few possibilities. One, I think we'll see that God is dynamic. If God is triune, God does not exist in stasis. Rather, God's self is fluid. God moves. Or to use Rohr's language again, God flows. God is flow. God dances. God is dance. Regardless of whether we'll learn to tolerate the discomfort of divine fluidity or not, we worship a God who is always on the move, always spilling over, always organic, always a surprise. God's coherence does not require God to be rigid. So why does this matter for us? Well, I think it matters because we human beings are prone to rigidity and stasis. We don't like change very much, and we're often reluctant to embrace what is new, what is unfamiliar, what is uncomfortable. But if God's nature is flow and movement and dance, then we need to find the courage to enter into that same flow, movement, and dance. We must be willing to evolve. Two, I think we'll see that God is diverse. If God exists in three persons, then each person has their own way of embodying and expressing goodness, beauty, love, and righteousness. As Rohr puts it, the Trinity affirms that there is an intrinsic plurality to goodness. Goodness does not equal sameness, he writes in The Divine Dance. Goodness, to be goodness, needs contrast and tension, not perfect uniformity. If God can incarnate goodness through contrast and tension, then it's worth asking why we can't or won't. Why do we fear difference so much when difference lies at the very heart of God's nature? Given the racism tearing apart our communities at this very moment, I can't imagine a more relevant characteristic to ponder than God's innate diversity. As churches, as communities, as countries, we will not survive unless we learn how to live gracefully and peaceably with difference. We will not heal unless we're honest about our fears, penitent about our histories, and unrelenting in our longing for God's diverse nature to be realized in its fullness among us. Third, I think we'll see that God is communal. Now, it's one thing to say that God values community or that God thinks community is good for us. It's a different thing to say that God is communal, that God is relationship, intimacy, connection, and communion. Evidence of this divine characteristic runs throughout the scriptures. When Jesus is baptized, God the Spirit descends in the form of a dove, and God the Creator parts the heavens to speak delight and affirmation. The Spirit of God drives Jesus into the wilderness for a time of testing and preparation. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus cries out to God the Creator for help and solace. It It is God the Creator who raises the crucified Jesus, vindicating his death through resurrection. You see, throughout the gospel stories, the three exist interdependently, leaning into each other. If God is interactive at God's very heart, if three is the deepest nature of the one, then what are we doing when we separate ourselves from each other? When we decide, oh, I can go it alone. When we privilege independence and autonomy over companionship and mutuality. When we prioritize people's individual rights over care and concern for the most vulnerable among us. If the Trinity really is more than a bit of dusty doctrine on a shelf that the early church fought over, then we dare not take lightly the life-changing power of the communal. God is relationship, and it is in relationship with God, ourselves, each other, and the world that we experience and embody God's nature. And finally, I think we'll see that God is sacrificial love. The Trinity, at its heart, is an expression of deep, unfaltering, and life-giving love between the Creator, the Christ, and the Holy Spirit. The relationship between the persons of the Godhead is not a relationship of domination, power-mongering, manipulation, or jealousy. It is a relationship of unselfish, sacrificial love, which begs the question, if God's very being is grounded in love and we are created in God's image, then who are we? What are we? Are we, like the triune God, whose imprint we bear, creatures motivated first and foremost by love? Is love what we're known for? If not, then what are we doing with our lives? What does our church attendance amount to? Why should we care about the 3-in-1? Well, I think we should care because we are children of the Trinity at a time when the world is reeling and desperate. We are the children of a mysterious, fluid, diverse, communal, hospitable, and loving God who wants to guide us into the whole truth of who God is and who we are. We should care because the mystery of the Trinity has the power to transform our hearts, leading us toward coherence and dynamism, unity and diversity, hospitality and self-giving love. This week and always, may our lives reflect the transformative beauty of the triune God. Praise and thanks be to God. Amen.